Our next speaker this morning is Richard Carter. Richard obviously has extensive experience working throughout the water and sanitation sector in many different capacities, but today he is talking to us with his UPGro hat on to tell us about some of the new and exciting research that's currently going on within the groundwater community.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, and thank you, Guy, for that setting the scene, really, for the day. I'll be coming to UPGro shortly. Guy has already mentioned it, but I'll say a little bit more in the middle of my presentation. I've always been of the view that, that research should be motivated by the contribution that it can make to development practice. I've tried throughout my career much of which has been spent in an academic environment, to keep at least one foot in the mud as well as the other in the clouds, if you like. Whether I've achieved that is another question. But I think what we really want to get out of today, but also get out of this whole initiative, is having scientists and practitioners talking to each other. And because that's what today is all about, I want to be quite brief and give you plenty of opportunity to do that. Those who know me from a water resources and WASH background will know that I have one obsession, and it's an obsession that Guy has already mentioned, and it's all about sustainability, about keeping things working. And that relates to both sides of what we're talking about today. It relates to the services that WASH provides, which are the focus of WASH professionals. But it also relates to the resources on which we rely, the focus of hydrogeologists. We're talking about services that last, but drawing on water resources which remain secure. Guy mentioned some work in Sierra Leone which DFID is funding. It may be also interesting to note that there are a couple of people in this room, Sinj Day over on my right and Peter Dumble at the back, who can say more about further work that DFID is funding in Sierra Leone on water resources and water security, which has particularly started to get some of the first groundwater monitoring underway in the country, with some very interesting results. I think Peter's going to talk more about that later. The last thing I just want to say in introduction is just picking up on a point that Guy brought up, or Steve and Guy brought up at the end, on value for money. And it seems to me that one of the things that we're not very good at is gauging the value for money of data and information. To me, those two things have immense value, but it's very difficult to quantify them. But there are a few examples where it is possible to do so. Anyway, let me continue with what I really want to talk about, which is the link up between research and practice. And just a thought or two about those two things. What is research? Fundamentally, generating new knowledge, building on what's already known, but extending our understanding in many different ways. It may be about methods, it may be about techniques, it may be about specific findings, it may be in specific places. And practice is all about the application of knowledge for a purpose, and the purpose that we're concerned with in this room today, I think is, as Geraint said, the humanitarian purpose of improving services for the poor. It seems to me that, if I can make this, yeah, that research is really about questioning, about investigating, and it's very much obsessed with rigor and reliability in the methods that it uses. And practice is a lot about doing and delivering services and being pragmatic and being urgent about what it does. But I don't think these two things are mutually incompatible. It's important to think about who does research as well. It's not just researchers, it's not just academics. There are a lot of organisations that are represented in this room that would not call themselves researchers or academic institutions, but they're heavily involved in learning, in innovation, in piloting, and so on. But it does seem to me that practitioners can really benefit from understanding more about the methods and the approaches that researchers take in order to be more systematic and methodical about how we operate. Getting research into use is not straightforward. This is only a very inadequate sketch of how it might work. It's a long and winding road from the initial research to getting something into widespread practice. And I think there's often a certain amount of naivety about thinking that a particular piece of research has got to have an impact in terms of wide use quite quickly. It doesn't work like that. There's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of piloting, gradually spreading awareness as a body of research builds up. Maybe a subject gets into the curriculum that's taught to people who then go out and practice. And it's a long, slow process. And it's very difficult to attribute impact to any individual piece of research. I suspect what I'm saying is probably quite welcome news for academics here, who have to justify their existence by the impact that their research makes. But the reality is that a lot of research either never gets written up or never used, it just falls out. A lot of innovation and research and development, the same. Pilots and trials often get to the end of their piloting phase, maybe never even get written up and drop out. They never become well known, they never get incorporated into the criteria, into the curricula, and they simply fall into the rubbish tip that hydrogeologists would call a landfill site. I was trying to think as I was preparing this, what kind of groundwater knowledge do water practitioners need? And one of the things that Guy drew attention to is maps, different kinds of maps. The kind of maps that geologists produce are often not particularly useful to practitioners as they stand. They need to be interpreted. Either as hydrogeological maps or interpreted in terms of drilling techniques, the different methods that are appropriate for siting of wells and boreholes. We need maps showing water levels, depths to water, yield, so-called. You can draw me on that one later if you want. For me, yield is not a very meaningful term. Certainly water quality we need maps of. But we need to go further than maps. We need understanding, basic groundwater understanding. Again, some of the things that Guy drew attention to, recharge rates. How quickly do groundwater levels respond to rainfall? How quickly do groundwater levels recede once the rainy season's over? And what kind of magnitude of seasonal variation are we talking about? Practitioners need guidance, guidance on very practical things like siting, on drilling and well construction methods, on how to supervise drilling contractors, how to procure and manage contracts, on things like costing and pricing of drilling. But particularly they need practical, local, reliable information. And it seems to me that this kind of information can come from two main sources. but channeled through a third. A lot of it can come through national geological survey activities, mapping and databases, but those databases need to be fed with the drilling records from contractors and their clients, who may be NGOs, and that often doesn't happen adequately. The second main source of science is research, pure research, and research and development. But a lot of this needs to be interpreted and turned into versions that different types of audiences can use by what are coming to be called knowledge brokers, those who can take that scientific information and translate it either into the form that practitioners need, or, again, as Guy pointed out, into the form that politicians need, which may be even more brief and to the point, with all the dangers around oversimplification that go with that. I do want to come to UPGro now. Some of you in this room are involved in this program. Others should become aware of it over the next few years. It's a 7-year program entitled Unlocking the Potential of Groundwater for the Poor. It's Africa-focused. It's co-funded by DFID and 2 of the research councils, NERC and the Economic and Social Research Council. Its intention is to facilitate high-quality research, but with a development purpose. So it fulfills many of the intentions of what we're talking about today. So far, the program has funded 15 so-called catalyst grants, short programs of about a year in duration, many of which are coming to an end now. And right now we're in a process of bidding for 3, 4 or 5 larger consortium grants, which will run over the next 4 years. If you can read any of this, this is a short summary of the 15 catalyst projects which are taking place in different parts of Africa. The majority, I think, in the Anglophone parts of Africa, but a few in Francophone countries. The majority focused on the natural science and the implications of that natural science, but with a social science component in some cases, and I think there'll be a greater social science component as we move into the consortium grants. There is a website for that program on the NERC website. There's just a screenshot of the front page. And I do encourage you to watch this space for further information. The consortium grant submission deadline is only a couple of weeks away. Those consortium grants will be approved later this year and then begin very early next year. So there'll be 3, 4 or 5 programs moving ahead over the next few years, and they'll no doubt produce some very informative data and understanding of hydrogeology in Africa and what it can mean for practice. I mentioned the role of knowledge brokers, and I want to particularly mention the Rural Water Supply Network, which is housed or hosted in the organisation SCAT in Switzerland. It's acting as the formal knowledge broker for the UPGro programme, but that's building on the existing work that it's been doing as a producer of very practitioner-friendly documentation around groundwater. But there are many other organisations that do this kind of thing. UNICEF has done significant work recently on manual drilling. The National Groundwater Association in the States produces interesting material too, and is intending to get into more and more training and capacity development in groundwater. I just want to mention some of the knowledge products that RWSN and SCAT have come through with in the last few years. Building, first of all, on this code of practice for cost-effective boreholes, and then producing a whole number of detailed, very accessible documents for for practitioners on supervision of well construction, on siting, on costing and pricing, on procurement and contract management, and on water resources and water husbandry, if you like. Those are freely available, downloadable from the RWSN website. How can practitioners engage with the research community? I think it's got to be a two-way process, not just the practitioners obtaining information from the scientific and research efforts, but we need, as practitioners, to be feeding data into national databases, so things like drill logs, test pumping records, water quality data, and there is absolutely no reason why practicing NGOs in the field can't be heavily engaged in water resource monitoring at very low cost to themselves, but very significant strategic benefit to the countries where they're working. I would urge all practitioner organisations here to be collaborating with research teams, because the one thing that research teams often don't have is easy access to field sites. And that's something that, of course, the WASH practitioner organisations do have. How can the research community better support practitioner organisations? It's really this whole thing about research into use. And I think the research community, it's important for them to make sure that their research is both relevant, but also versioned and translated into forms that practitioners can use and understand. How can we practitioners make better use of groundwater research? Well, by demanding relevant research in the first place, but taking time to engage with the material that's produced, and there's plenty of it. And with the increasing focus on open access publishing, there's no reason not to be able to get at it. We need to be talking to each other, we need to be working together. I'll just finish with 3 images which I think emphasize that. Cheese is nothing without pickle. Fish and chips, locks and keys. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the dialogue you have.
Thank you, Richard. I think that's starting to get to the centre of some of the issues that we want to be discussing today. So if anybody has any... We've left lots of time for questions. So if anybody has any questions for Richard, go on for it. Yeah,
Richard, some wonderfully mature reflections on things like the value of hydrological data, and also this difficult business of moving from research to practice. I'm focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm conscious that there is an issue which you didn't mention I want to get your opinion about. This is that Africans have to do this in the end. And this raises questions about the nature of groundwater and where groundwater sits in institutions in the African continent. And it seems to me, from a rather distant perch these days, but that the traditional home which the Geological Survey is struggling to maintain itself in many countries, particularly in hydrogeology, if there's no major mining interest, And the enormous push from all the European donors is into basin organizations for completely different reasons. I mean, because there are all sorts of major mega political issues that have to be addressed in surface water. And I wondered if you had any reflections about whether, one, where groundwater knowledge should sit in sub-Saharan African countries, and two, should we be making more noise about our opinion on this?
Thank you very much, Steve. First of all, I fully agree with you. The practice and the research needs to be done and owned in Africa, or in the countries that we're talking about. I think for too long, research has been driven by donor funding from the West, with research teams also from the West. And even though there are collaborations with African research institutions, they're rather one-sided, it seems to me. We need to really change that whole paradigm. I think I agree with you that geological surveys are struggling, and that's a shame, because the fundamental importance of mapping is still there, and it's not been completed everywhere. It does seem to me that where groundwater resources and other water resources tend to sit now is within directorates of water resources in ministries of water resources or the equivalent. The difficulty is that those directorates of water resources deal with the quantity and quality of water, and often to a rather limited extent with groundwater. It tends to be more on surface water. And the communication with the other directorates of those ministries that deal with the services is not as strong as it should be. I'm sure others can comment on that too. It doesn't seem to me to be fundamentally wrong that that's where responsibility for groundwater mapping and monitoring and resource understanding should sit. But it does seem to me that there should be much better integration between the resource side and the service side. We generally put those in silos.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you. Peter Ravenscroft from UNICEF and the World Bank. Richard, you talked about two things in the transfer of knowledge from research into practice. You talked a lot about guidance, and on one slide you mentioned curricula. Now, for people like ourselves, guidance is all very neat because it fits into the project and contract framework. It's delivered, and some of this guidance is very large. Probably, I would say, much too large in its scope. The problem is, if it doesn't fall on receptive ears, that guidance is going to be wasted. So what do you think about where we are on the balance between guidance versus curricula in your chain of knowledge transfer?
Ooh. Receptive ears, I am fully with you. I spent 3 years working as head of technical support in WaterAid, and one of the core things that we tried to do was to develop generic guidance for the 26 or so country programs on a whole range of different topics. It was very difficult to produce that guidance because you're trying to distill information which is applicable across a number of continents and a very large number of countries. But looking back, that was the easy bit. Getting it into people's heads and into their practice is really the challenge. And I don't know whether we really succeeded in that. Because a lot of the time we're dealing with cultures which describe themselves as non-reading cultures. So simply pushing out guidance documents is not enough. I struggle with this to know what we should be doing. I certainly think we should be producing very brief material. Guy referred to the kind of short, very short, one-page briefs that politicians need, but I think also scientists and practitioners need very short stuff too. But the difficulty in producing it is not being too simplistic. As soon as you distill something down, the danger is you just oversimplify. I think somehow we've got to draw people in, and we've got to be more imaginative about communication, not just communicating on paper, but using all sorts of audiovisual communication methods, using mobile telephones, using anything that can really engage people's attention and get them to start being curious and then to demand more. You mentioned the curriculum as well. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that we try to do a lot is, and anybody who works in developing countries will know that they suffer from workshop-itis. There are workshops after workshops after workshops trying to put over these kind of guidance approaches. I think they're of limited effectiveness. You can start to really get learning established in people's minds when they're on longer programs of study, master's degrees and so on. You can't achieve much in short workshops. So I think the core curriculum of master's programs is probably really fundamental to changing the way practice is done. But inevitably that means we're talking of decades and generations of change. Don't know if that answers your question, but
I think if we have one very, very quick last question.
Thank you. Kim Morton, KLM Consulting, Johannesburg. I certainly agree with all the points that have been made about making data more African-centric. And certainly from our side in Johannesburg, we've been working with SADC countries through our mining contacts to make sure that whatever data is being collected is universally available. And just to back up what you're saying about sound bites becoming more important in educating, we found that YouTube clips are changing the way most of the nations that we're dealing with are learning. And so instead of handing over reams of paper about how to supervise a borehole, we have video clips of this is how you do it. And in 30 minutes, they have an indication with guidance. And of course, what is changing sub-Saharan Africa is the internet. Yeah. It's absolutely fabulous how many people are talking to each other now. And where I see the European donor agencies helping us Africans is assisting in communication. I'm sure you're aware that the African internet is the most expensive in the world. Every time it crosses a border, it costs more and more. So if there's some way of making groundwater information more cheaply available and faster internet through dialogue with the internet providers, I think that would make a great difference, because there is such a huge desire to learn and a desire to get it right now. So I think I have to agree with everything yourself and Stephen have been saying.
Thank you, Kim. I don't think I need to respond to that. It's a comment. Thank you.